So please join me in welcoming Senator John Laird.
Thank you very much. I should make a statement. For those of us that are somewhat pale and spend a lot of time outside, you have to be careful it comes home to roost. And so I'm not wearing my hat today as a fashion statement. It finally came home to roost after 40 or 50 years of being out in the sun. And a couple of other things. It is great. London Nelson, I'm sorry. Seems like just home territory, and my first campaign kickoff was down the hallway 44 years ago. And the other interesting thing is I worked for the county administrator when we acquired Laurel School to become a London Nelson Center. And what was interesting is there was a conservative group in charge of Santa Cruz City at the time, and they didn't like this, and so they wanted to use whatever they could to try to delay it or keep it from happening. So they said, this will cause a parking nightmare. And I kept arguing, no, it won't, no, it won't. And then years later, I think of that when I'm circling the neighborhood and can't find a parking space. So, yeah, you know, karma is bad. What I want to do, and I think there's going to be time for a few questions, what I was hoping to do is talk a little bit at a high level about the state of play right now, and then some maybe more specific things that you might be interested in, and go to questions. And it's interesting because I spoke, I think it was last year, at a conference on the state of the Salinas River, and it was in northern San Luis Obispo County, and they just liked it so much, they just got in touch a year later and said, can we just post your comments? And my staff said, you might want to look at them to see that you still agree with whatever you said. But the thing is right at the beginning, I said, you know, my experience as an elected official in centers, and I brought up the San Lorenzo River, and I brought up the fact that when I was elected to the city council 44 years ago and sort of took the lead on water issues, we were not at the same stage of climate change that we are now. And so what happened is in those days, the river would flow maybe as late as May, and then you would fall back on the other water sources. And we had and have 9, I know Heidi's here, there's people here from Chris from the water department that may well correct me at some point, but at the time we had 9 water sources and we never needed them all. So we sort of brought them online in the order of their cost or their difficulty in doing. And now with the change in climate, I mean, we're lucky to have a little rain later today and yesterday, but the river slows down way before it used to, and it puts a whole different pressure on either the species or just the ecosystem, as well as the water that we take from the river to drink. And so it means that everything we planned, and I used to say this as Secretary for Natural Resources because I had to administer the state water system, and I would say this water system was designed in one climate, but we're in a different climate, but with a water system that was still based on the previous one. And when I was in the assembly, I had a select committee on California water needs and climate change, and it was our estimate at the time, and this was 15 or 20 years ago, that the Sierra snowpack would diminish dramatically and significantly by the turn of the next century. And yet our entire water system statewide is designed around that. And it's such that 3 million acres of irrigated agriculture and water districts that serve 25 million people rely on a water system that won't have the snowpack that has fueled it since California built water systems. And so the question of the day, and it's one that got mentioned in coming here, is how are we coping or responding or dealing with the meltdown of the federal government with regard to climate and environmental programs. And it's an interesting breakdown because it's basically, you don't want to further that agenda by constantly making the case about it or talking about it in every inch of the way. And at the same time, we have to fight it to make sure that we can stall as long as possible. When I was Resources Secretary, and in 2017, they proposed to drill off the coast, and I was the point person, again in my career, against offshore oil drilling. The key thing we discovered is if they followed the process as it was set out, they couldn't get to a lease within 4 years of a presidential term. So our strategy was to stall as much as we could and try to get to the next term. And that's actually what happened. And then Biden did a moratorium and other things. This time, they are much more smarter in an evil perspective, in the sense that they're trying to cut back on public comment, cut back on environmental review, because they know that takes time. And they want to see if they can get this done in a short amount of time. And that is true about a lot of the environmental stuff that is going on at the federal level. And the flip side of it is that we have to, as a state, continue to do what we were doing on January 19th of a year ago, which is try to lead the nation in climate response, try to make sure that we still have strong environmental protections across the state. And if you look at last year, for example, we renewed the cap and trade program. Now the governor calls it cap and invest, which is a modified carbon market. And it's just us in Quebec at this point, although the state of Washington has come in certain ways. And that's significant for the health of the river, in that there are a lot of things that reduce greenhouse gases that can be paid for that are related to river health in different places around the state. And so renewing cap and trade got us there. And in the state of play, about 3 months ago, I was promoted to be chair of the Senate Budget Committee. And it's very funny, I had a work day a week or two ago that was about 14 hours, and I called home late at night and recapped the day and was complaining, and my spouse says, "You wanted this. Stop saying a thing." And of course he was right, because this is the chance that you can really affect things in a major way, because so many different things are budget issues. So the governor did a sleight of hand on cap and trade, where we sort of had this deal that he would get $1 billion for high-speed rail, and we would get $1 billion for legislative greenhouse gas priorities. And then when he presented the budget in January, he spent our billion as well as his billion. And so we will be releasing a framework of a budget from the Senate in the next 10 days or so, and included will be buying back that $1 billion so that we can put it back in, and then we will decide certain priorities on greenhouse gases across the state that we will do with that. And then, so I went to Climate Week in New York last September, because we thought it was important to let the country know and the world know that we are not pausing or hesitating in the face of what's going on at the federal level. And so cap and trade is one. Another is in November of 2024, the voters approved a $10 billion climate bond that we put on the ballot. The first $3 billion went out last year. The governor has proposed another $2 billion this year. Some of it is for fuels management, dam safety. There's different ways that it intersects with ecosystem health, but our budget proposal will propose expediting more funding from that bond. And there are different things that come locally. In land conservation, even though it's not the San Lorenzo River, there's a special pot in that bond that I'm very pleased with, that nobody seemed to be paying attention to when we were drafting the bond. But there's roughly $50 million for San Andreas Corridor wildlife crossing issues that really transects my district almost perfectly. And so we will be dealing with land conservation and watershed protection in the San Andreas corridor with that pot of money, and the first money is scheduled to get out. We have doubled down on our climate goals, and our climate goals are really some form of carbon neutrality by 2045, and you know, battery storage we could spend an entire meeting on. It has become controversial in different ways, but the battery storage increase in the last 8 years has been such that it's allowed us to bring a lot of wind and solar on that wasn't there, and we still have more goals to do that, because you have to figure out a way that when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, you have stored it so there's more energy to come back onto the grid, renewable energy that is reliable. And so we are working on meeting those goals. The governor signed an executive order a few years ago on 30 by 30, and what it meant is conserving 30% of our land-based resources and 30% of the state ocean waters by 2030. And this has then configured lots of different action on that in terms of investment, protections, conservation easements, and it's caused a nightmare in the coastal part of it, just because we worked so hard for the marine protected areas to base it on science and to defend against the industries that didn't want to protect the marine areas and didn't want to regenerate the species. And we did it by science. With the governor just adopting a number, people think, oh, let's just do more percents of the waters, and it undermines the science that we used thus far to protect and defend legally and politically the marine protected areas. Doesn't mean we're not going to do more, doesn't mean we can't make it work, but we have to really make sure it's based on the science so we can defend it and measure it and show that species are coming back because of those actions. And then there's the question about, are we fighting? And we have appropriated $50 million to the state attorney general to file a lawsuit on every cutback in healthcare, environmental protection, that is coming from the federal government, and he is banding together with 15 or 17 other attorney generals, and they're filing major lawsuits together to do this. And we've been after them to make sure they will do an offshore oil lawsuit at the appropriate time, and Justin Cummings has really been taking the lead here, and he's bugging me about making sure I have the attorney general's ear so the attorney general does a lawsuit at the right time. On offshore oil, I have done a resolution opposing the federal proposal, and at this point I have 47 co-authors. I have every Senate Democrat but one on the bill, and that one represents oil in Bakersfield, and so I thought we'd be lucky to get her, but we got every single other Democrat from across the spectrum to oppose this. And we will still try to move ahead on electric vehicles and other things to just constantly make sure our program is moving ahead. And then on a couple of issues that might be front and center to this symposium, we adopted a bill last year, AB 1319, by Assemblymember Schultz from Los Angeles. And it basically sets up a process for the Fish and Wildlife Department to, if the federal government delists different species from endangered species, to have a process for California could list them. So if the federal government retreats on certain species, we would move in and try to list them and hold it until we get to some federal administration that doesn't want to delist species. And there has been some concerns about the implementation, and I am watching it closely, and it was speculated to cost between $7 and $9 million a year. I'm looking at the budget to make sure that we have the money and we fund that, but to make sure it's done in a way that it accomplishes what we were trying to do and doesn't have unintended consequences on how the the listing is done. There's also been concerns about the statewide fuels mitigation plan. And the governor did an executive order to sort of, I don't know, the buzzword of the day is streamline, but is to run over certain environmental protections and processes to try to get things done quicker in a different way. And there are concerns, and I know from some people in this group, that the ecosystems and watersheds might not be protected to their fullest as per existing law if this runs over it in how the fuels is done. And I read their report, and they're really talking about protecting tribal resources, and on paper, they say the right things about not running over ecosystems. I think it's just going to require some vigilance to make sure that's absolutely true. And then, because when I was resources secretary, we had this convoluted system where if somebody wanted to, excuse me, if somebody wanted to do a plan to do an environmental report for fuels management, there had to be an individual EIR and an opt-in and opt-out done by every area in the state. And we finally did a programmatic EIR that covered the whole state so that everybody didn't have to redo it. And it was really a process that got in the way of some of that being done. And one of the more amazing stories is they were just getting ready in Paradise to do this process when the fire happened. And they had to mail notices to everybody in their area to allow them the chance to opt out or opt in, and they picked up all these notices to be mailed. The fire was starting to come. They put them in a car. The car survived with all the notices, but the print shop burned down, and most of the places they were mailing to burned down. So it was not the same situation, and there has to be a way that we protect our environmental principles, and at the same time don't make it so hard to do that in places where it really needs to be done. And that is the balance, and it's trying to enforce it and police it in a way that you know that those environmental principles are being protected. The backdrop of all of this is we're in the middle of one of the craziest governor's races I have ever watched. And the thing that, and we don't know, it's changing by day, as you can tell if you've been paying attention in the last 24 hours. And it will be up to whoever comes out of this race to enforce some of these things. And I know I have attended various environmental meetings where the candidates have been quizzed, and I'm concerned that there won't be a commitment to the right thing or understanding or willingness to put the right people in place. And so there's certain deals I have made on environmental issues in this administration, and I am trying to get them all buttoned up before January 1st, because I don't know that whoever comes next is going to hold to them in the same way. And for example, I've been on this campaign to save and conserve the 12,000 acres of land around the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. It is some of the choicest undeveloped land along the entire California coast, and particularly in the central coast. Well, I can't think of a polite way to say it. About 3 months ago, I ran over PG&E at the Coastal Commission, and PG&E was willing to conserve 1,000 acres of the 12,000 acres, and by the time we were done at the Coastal Commission, they're either protecting, or there's a path to protecting 8,000 of the 12,000 acres, and we are determined to get the next 4,000, and the governor is involved in some of those deals, and I want to make sure they're all signed and sealed before we have a change in administration to make sure those lands are protected. And that's another reason to get some of the Proposition 4 money out so that we can get it out for the goals for which it was intended, and do that now just in case we have somebody that isn't committed in the same way that is coming into the governor's office. Well, some of that was random, but I was trying to just give you an overview of both where we are in fighting the feds, where we are in not letting them design our policy, and to move ahead on climate and environmental protection, and how we have some individual things that we're monitoring closely and hope to implement in the right way, and all of them will affect the health of the San Lorenzo River. So in whatever time is left, I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
We've already got a question back here.
Thank you so much, Senator, for all your advocacy and important work. I often think of how do we ensure, and I know as you're working hard, I don't mean to push you aside in terms of your next steps, but I hope that you continue to advocate after your term is done, and I hope that we can ensure that someone who is in your footsteps and being mentored by you can walk alongside you and then into your role, because I am afraid for what's coming next. We need more of you.
Well, first let me say, I have 2.5 years left. I'm not dead yet. And we have a lot to do, and I am really conscious of what you're saying. Because if you look at the legislature, it sort of tips environmental, but what really matters is whether you have people that will take the lead and do the work, not just be the ones that will vote correctly in a committee. And so I know I've been talking to some people that might potentially be candidates to make sure that they are there and they understand this. And I think one of the hardest things is that, and I understand this more every day, politics is about relationships. And so I had a 25-year career locally, and by the time I'm done, I'll have a 25-year career at the state. And this assembly member that's brand new said to me, I don't understand, with all the rules, how have you been around here so long? And I said, hey, old rules, 14 years in the legislature, 8 years in the cabinet, a year on the waste board, doing other things. But in the course of that, I have developed relationships where I can call the director of Fish and Wildlife and say, this doesn't seem right. Will you do this? And that I can vet something. I'm to the point now where I think, because the introduction didn't include the latest year, I think I've put in 5 years 74 bills on the governor's desk, and he signed 73. And the one he didn't sign really irritated me. It was a sea level rise, and so he signed it the next year. We got it back, but part of it is I have relationships there, and before I introduce a bill with various stakeholders in the committees and the governor's office and the state departments, I will say, I really want to do this. What can't you live with? And then I can figure out a way to thread the needle, like not give them something to oppose the bill, but not weaken the bill so it still does everything that I intended for it to do. And over the course of both a Senate and Assembly, I've done the major bills on water conservation to establish the Sierra Conservancy, to establish the Sustainable Ag Land Conservation Program to protect agriculture across the state with conservation easements, and actually did the negotiations that saved the Lake Tahoe Compact. And when some people wanted to take down the marine protected areas. I did negotiations with the tribes that brought them from opposition and support, so that was a very key part. And all of that was due to relationships. And so in mentoring people, those are hard. You don't establish them overnight. And some people need to be doing it before they even get to the legislature, so they feel like they have those connections and they can do it. So I'm working on that, but we'll see what happens.
Okay, we have time for just one more question. Had a hand over here.
Thank you so much. I work in the statewide river advocacy and water policy organization called Friends of the River. And you mentioned earlier the pullbacks of protections on endangered species and things like that, and pushing forward to get states that say we're working to get like excursion listed among other things. But then there's also conversations about using other regulations like Fishing Game Code 5937 and other avenues to try to protect rivers and keep water in rivers for endangered species as federal protection pullback. So I just wondered if you could comment more on that, getting insight into ways we can push that forward.
Thank you for your question, and that would be worth an hour seminar all by itself. Because I think what's been happening is some of those code sections have been weaponized on both sides of some of the issues, in particular water and water supply, because we really need to have a Bay Delta plan that sort of meets the dual goals of some water supply, but at the same time protecting the environment. And you know, in the Delta, and this is ground zero for the issue that you just asked about, when Europeans arrived in California, there were 500,000 acres of wetlands in the Delta. When I took office as Resources Secretary, there were 30,000. And so part of our strategy, and we had, I think by the time we were done, 20,000 acres of restoration in the Delta. We have been trying to do restoration of that, and then it fits into some of those code sections, in that the code sections sort of require that you do protections in the face of it. And there's been big concerns that they have been weakened in some way by the administration. And I'm not talking about the federal administration. And so that's the challenge. And what it means is that you can't rely on anything. And this would be my last message for everything, which is that you always think you have won something, and it's won and it's over. That is just not true. You are refighting the battle. I mean, I tell the story on an unrelated but related one, that I was just getting into my teens when the Civil Rights Act was signed, and I went, oh, thank God we took care of that. And that is something that a 14-year-old would think, because we refight civil rights every generation, every time. And that is also true with the issues you raise about wetlands protection and wetlands restoration. And it's not enough to have the code section. It's making sure it's implemented in a way that is intended and actually protects things. So, and believe it or not, that's the brief answer. So I have to leave in a little while. I'll hang around, but thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here today.